Goeienaand, Eden FM luisteraars en welkom hier by Ons Sit Koppe Bymekaar. En kan julle dit glo, vir die wat nie weet wat Ons Sit Koppe Bymekaar is, dis die gespreksreeks met ek, Thea Smith en Hans van der Veen en Ronelle Lemmer. En kan julle glo, vanaand is ons 50ste episode, ons is 50 episodes oud, Hans en Ronelle. Wat sê julle?
Ek steek 'n kersie aan, Thea, vir 'n birthday kersie om te sê dankie julle vir 50 keer se saamgesels en 50 keer se koppe bymekaar sit.
Ja, goeienaand, Ronelle, goeienaand, Hans.
Goeienaand, Thea, Ronelle, luisteraars, lekker om saam met julle weer te wees.
Ja, kan jy glo 50 episodes later, Hans?
Ja, verlede week was dink ek was dit net my presies 'n jaar terug wat die eerste COVID geval in Suid-Afrika aangeteken is, nê? En en ons is nou 50 episodes aan die gang. Dit is ook ons program is gebore hierso tydens die lockdown. En ja, gelukkig is ons daar nou weer terug op level 1 en so 'n bietjie meer vryheid, né?
Ja. So, dit is regtig, ek het nie gedink ons gaan nie ver kom nie, en ek wil net vanaand somme vir Eden FM somme dankie sê, vir al hulle geduld met ons, en dat hulle ons so mooi geleer het, en veral vir Jason, wat in die atelier is, en elke aand, of elke maandag aand, van tyd tot tyd met ons live sessions het. Jason, baie dankie. Wie het gedink, jy gaan 50 episodes met ons uithou? So, en luisteraars, dankie vir julle ondersteuning ook, en dankie vir julle wat luister en wat comment en vir ons boodskappe stuur op die Facebook bladsy. As julle ons vanaand wil gelukwens en die videoetjie wil sien, dan kan julle gaan na Klein Karoo Connect, waar julle hierdie videoetjie kan sien 'n bietjie later in die week. En dan kan julle sien, ek het so rooi veer in my hare, en Ronelle het 'n kers wat sy aangesteek het, en Hans het so 50 tekentjie om te vanaand te vier. Maar ek gee nou oor aan Hans, want vanaand het ons 'n spesiale gas vir Hans. Jy gaan ons gas vanaand voorstel. Baie dankie.
Dankie. Ja, luisteraars, Linda, I've known you for, I think, 10 years or so. Linda Ravenhill, and Linda did a master's dissertation in search of a good death. And I remember when she was doing it, I visited their house in Johannesburg, and I said, I've never seen as many books on the topic of death on a bookshelf. It looked like a library, but all of it was on death. And when she spoke about the topic in search of a good death, it was just mind-blowing how well she expressed herself. And I thought the 50th episode, in a way, with COVID, has made us aware of our own sort of finiteness, our own mortality. And Linda has agreed to come talk to us and share some of her experiences and her wisdom. And more than that, Linda is also somebody that she was an ICU nurse, so she worked in hospitals and in matters of life and death. And then she moved into technology, and quite acclaimed at that. She was nominated as Africa Middle East Women in Technology. She was awarded for that prize. She was nominated for that prize. Quite a wonderful achievement, and we're glad to have her with us tonight to listen to her. So thank you, Linda.
Hi, Hans. Thank you very much, guys, and congratulations on your 50th. I'm going to start my video and see if my connection holds out. There we go.
There we go.
There we go. Hi, guys. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And as I say, you guys do amazing work, so congratulations on your 50th. And great hats, Thea. For anybody.
Thank you.
Oops. So yes, as Hans said, we go back way longer, Hans, by the way, about 18 years. It's just, I think, as you get older, you forget how time flies. So as Hans said, I am an ICU nurse. I began my career at the Charlotte Maclecker Hospital here in Johannesburg, and I specialized in trauma. And I think that's where my interest in both how do we obtain a good death, but also in matters of elder care, of how we look after our aged in our society, I think first started to arise. And then, as Hans said, after that, I went traveling, as you do, and I came back and I was privileged enough to work with the South African Medical Association. And it was there I was first introduced to the internet. And if you're an information junkie, that was way back in the 90s. It was paradise to me. I couldn't believe that you could just type in something. Here came this information. So that sparked my internet journey. I taught myself to code and develop. And my business today comes out of both of my fields of interest, which is around using technology to spread medical knowledge, principally to doctors and the healthcare profession, but also just around driving quality access to quality information. And that's really a bit of my background. So, the death subject, as Hans said, it sounds a bit grim, but I promise you it isn't. Once you get into it, it's absolutely fascinating. And I must put a caveat here that the thesis was written before the pandemic arose, so it was quite timeless. In fact, I was awarded my thesis during the pandemic. So one of the plans, as I was mentioning earlier, is to go back once we're able to, and to relook at how things have changed from the concerns I had then to the concerns that have arisen now, and how that's changed things.
Linda, I was actually, I read your dissertation, and there are a few things that obviously stood out for me and that just spoke to me at the time that we in. I like this quote that you put in your dissertation that says, dying is not an event, it's a phenomenon to be understood existentially.
Yes.
Can you, and it was so interesting because with the other things that you write in your dissertation, it's about how people wait for death. But death is also, it's a process. It's not just a once-off year it happens, although apart from motor vehicle accidents or heart attacks or things like that, but dying in old age, it is really a process. And can you maybe speak to us a bit about that?
Sure, and it's actually interesting you picked up on that, because the word death actually refers to the process of dying. It actually, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's a Proto-Germanic word, and that's what it means, the process of dying. And I think that when I was writing the thesis, I interviewed across a broad spectrum of people, from traditional healers to pathologists, just to try and understand what does death mean right now in this age. And one of the pathologists, and I mentioned this in the thesis, he said to me, why are you so fixated on death in the elderly? Because everybody dies. So the only thing that matters is whether you die fast, as you mentioned, in a motor vehicle accident, or whether you die slowly. And I really, through my experience and as a nurse, and I have two elderly parents, or had two elderly parents, I really believe that the way we age and the way that we die are intricately linked. I think there's a very big difference between someone who's dying young and someone who's dying elderly, not least because people kind of think it's less sad when you die when you're old as opposed to younger. And I guess it is, but the process remains the same. I just think that the trauma that is visited upon the aged is out of context with the natural process of things. And I think that one of the other issues around dying when you're older, or around death in the elderly, is it is a trajectory. It's ups and downs. And if you have elderly parents, or you've been around someone who's elderly, like today you get the phone call, come quick, they're dying, and then you get there and they're sitting up drinking tea. And so there's all that emotion that comes, and then they go home and it's fine for 2 months, and then you get another call, come quick, it's time. And it's this up and down trajectory that I think facilitated, not in no small part by medicine, by the way medical interventions have assisted us in prolonging our life. So that up and down trajectory has many consequences for the way we die. It matters to the emotional, it has an emotional impact, a societal impact, and there's a very high financial cost attached to that. In my thesis, I wrote, it's all about the money. And that's where I actually started. My departure point was the reason that we are prolonging death in the elderly, or prolonging life in the elderly, should I say rather, is around the money. I obviously subsequently I still believe that to a certain point, and I can qualify that, but I think there's more to it than what I initially thought. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Linda, I remember reading something about in the last 6 months or a year of an elderly person's life, like 50% of their medical expenses can be incurred. That is,
exactly.
Do I remember correctly?
Yes, that's exactly the quote. Yeah. And I think the important part there is to say with no appreciable difference, and with immense trauma. So you spot on the money. And in fact, in America, what was very interesting as well is how little data is available locally. So a lot of what I had to do was to look at overseas information and then look at, try and patch the pieces together here. So that was quite fascinating. But in America, they say 5% of their in total medical aid spend is spent in the last 1 month of care. And here's another interesting stat, if you're interested, that it costs twice as much money to go into an ICU and to die in an ICU as it does to stay at home and prolong your life. And those figures are startling. And we actually can't sustain that in our economy. And where we have so many issues, social issues we have to address, that kind of spend is really not sustainable. And it's, many people believe this is our next public health crisis.
So, Linda, I'm just thinking, because as medical people, and obviously as a nurse and we psychologists, we get taught the ethical principle of non-maleficence. So, do no harm.
I knew that was going to come up.
What do you think about? Because this is obviously the point of argument that. And I must be honest. The other day, I was confronted with the same question, because I'm a qualified physiotherapist as well, and I saw an elderly patient, and somebody asked me. I was doing chest physio, and this person asked me, he looks as if he's not going to make it. This patient has been deteriorating over the last couple of days. And this person asked me, why are you still doing physiotherapy?
It's incredibly tough. And I think that was all through my paper. When I started this process, I came at it with a very one-dimensional, that this is wrong and there has to be a cutoff point. But as I started to explore the issues more, I came up more and more against what you're saying, that grey area. So to go back to the Hippocratic Oath, what I found out, and I believed it too, that it's about the do no harm. But actually the Hippocratic Oath doesn't say that at all. It doesn't mention the do no harm. We have interpreted it as do no harm. What it actually says, and this is the new one, it's just been rewritten. Can I read this to you? Because I think this is fascinating.
Yes, please.
So it's been rewritten now in 2019. So it says, if it is given to me to save a life, all thanks. But it may also be within my power to take a life. And this awesome responsibility must be faced with humbleness and awareness of my own frailty. Above all, I must not play God. So that is the new Hippocratic Oath. And I think for me, that says everything that I was trying to communicate with the work. Is like, you're not God. But in helping someone ease their pain and ease their process, to me, and this is a very personal opinion, I don't see how that falls under hypermedicalization. I think things like ventilation and dialysis when you're 90 and there's no hope of survival. That to me is hypermedicalization. Doing chest physio to help someone breathe a bit easier that's about comfort. That's about palliation. And so I understand exactly what you're saying. And then you start looking at the differences between euthanasia and palliative care. And that's also
Exactly.
great. Yeah, whereas palliative medicine is just really about managing your pain, making you comfortable. Whereas euthanasia, be it, well, then there's active and passive euthanasia. So it's a very grey area. And I think at some point, you know, I looked at the Health Professions Council palliative care guidelines. I don't know if you are familiar with those as a team. They came out in 2019. And even there, it's very grey as to what falls under excessive care and what falls under sort of palliation. It's a very grey area, and I think it comes down to almost a moral standpoint at the end of the day.
So, Eden FM listeners, we are talking to Linda Ravenhill, and we are talking about death and dying. And it's not such a somber topic, I think, because it's important aspects that she's talking about. But we are going to have to go to a music break right now. So we are listening to Born in a Taxi by BLK Sunshine. And please come back, listeners, and you can even send a WhatsApp to Eden FM if you want to ask or give an opinion. And please, let's be interactive tonight. So enjoy the music. See you after the break. Goeienaand, welkom terug Eden FM luisteraars. Hier by Ons Sit Koppe Bymekaar. Vanaand is ons 50ste episode, kan julle dit glo? En ons wil net dankie sê aan almal wat elke week luister en almal wat ons ondersteun. En ek is seker Ronelle en Hans sal 'n shout-out gee later aan die mense wat hulle ondersteun, maar ek gee net 'n shout-out aan my ouers en my familie en my vriende wat elke week getrou na my ons stemmetjie luister. Nou vanaand praat ons met Linda Ravenhill en ons praat eintlik is nou so 'n bietjie teenoor 'n celebration of 'n feesviering, want ons praat vanaand oor die dood. Ek dink is toepaslik. Ek dink baie mense het mense verloor tydens hierdie COVID periode en dis hoekom ons hierdie program begin het. Linda, but actually I'm not saying it's opposite of a celebration, you know, that we're talking about death and we're celebrating 50 episodes, but to some people death is actually a celebration.
Absolutely. And I think it's actually interesting that you say that, because if you go back into the history of how we died through the ages, in the ancient Greeks, death was celebrated because that was the next level in your journey. So someone like Epicurus, who we believe is the hedonistic in search of pleasure, he believed that a good death was the ultimate. That's what you aimed for, and that was the ultimate in pleasure and the hedonistic goal. So I think the process of that's not to say you can't mourn, but the process of coming to believe that death is bad or is kind of the end of everything is a fairly modern phenomena and getting worse. So for me, I think the celebration is you should celebrate all aspects of life, and death is part of it. We've just made it something, you know, to be looked at in the dark and not to be brought out into the light. I believe.
Yeah, because I'm thinking in the Christian community, death is definitely a form of moving on, you graduate, you move on to another form of being with God. And I mean, various faiths have got different viewpoints regarding that.
Yeah, no, and are you, hello?
Yes.
Hi, sorry.
Yes, Linda.
Sorry, I missed you there. No, absolutely. But what is interesting as well, Thea, as different as we are in our beliefs, we are actually very similar at our heart. So the more you start to delve in it and strip away, we all do believe the same things. So for me, I think the process of coming to terms with your death and at least considering it as part of your life is actually very liberating. And when I started this, I thought people were going to, friends like Hans said, he looked at my bookshelf and it's just books on death. And I thought, people are going to think how morbid and what's wrong with this girl. But the more I read, the more almost relief I felt for myself, because I count myself as no one's immune to it. And there's a quote by Steve Jobs, I think it says, anyone who tells you they're not afraid is lying. I think we're all afraid. It's the unknown, so I think it's just about coming to terms with it being unknown, and to at least talking about it with your families, I think takes some of the fear away. So it certainly helps. It was cathartic in a way, selfishly.
Yes. You spoke about those death cafes that you went to. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about that, Linda? What is these death cafes involve?
So when I started this process, I wanted to look as widely as I could to see what was out there. And in some of my searching, I came across this concept of a death cafe, which was started in the United States. And there are actually two very interesting new movements prior to Corona. So the death cafe is really basically can be run by anybody, and it's generally held in a restaurant or a tea room or what have you, and there's cake and tea on sale, hence the cafe. And what they do is it's a place for people to come and who are either dying or have experienced death, to be in a safe space where they can talk freely and be around people that understand where they're coming from. And I think, even now, when you talk about death, people are uncomfortable with it. And I think there's an expectation that someone died, and I've seen it through Corona. Someone died, okay, it's been a week, come back to work now, and that's fine, just let's move on, let's get back to production, and it doesn't work like that. Someone told me when my dad died, it takes about at least a year before you even really understand what's happened to you and start to deal with it. And I actually believe that is true. And so the Death Cafe takes away all of that. It strips away the need to explain or the need to apologize or any of that. And you can just talk freely in a community. So what they do is they generally have a speaker about some topic. And then you split into groups and then you just talk. And at first I was like, I was really nervous, Hans will tell you. I took my husband with me because I thought, I'm not really sure what I'm going to. Is this like a seance type thing or where am I going? And it was absolutely wonderful. What I learned there, how open people were and how, I'm using the word liberation a lot, but just how freeing it was to not have to apologize for grief or to have to apologize for thinking about death and dying, but to be amongst people who it was normal. It was absolutely normal that you felt this way. I mean, Hans will tell you, I burst out crying. I don't know why, but I was crying my eyes out. It was going, oh, don't worry. And I was like, I don't even know why I'm crying. But it was completely acceptable. There wasn't that appropriation that I see in a lot of everyday life. And so that was the Death Cafe. I actually went on before I came online to see, and I obviously with COVID, there hasn't been that many in South Africa. But if you just Google Death Cafe, you'll generally find a venue next to you. And as I say, anyone can start it. It's not something you have to belong to or a group. It's more of a philosophy, I believe.
Linda, sorry.
No, I was going to say there is a really interesting movement as well called Let's Talk About Death Over Dinner, which was started by a chef called Michael Hebbs in the States. And it's a similar concept. And he basically says, where do we meet with our friends and family? Where are we most at home? It's around the dinner table. So it's around having dinner and then talking about death and dying and what you want and your experiences. And so that's also a very interesting concept that I think we should do more of. Sorry, Ronelle.
No, actually, it's wonderful how the things that we talk about and we've talked about in the past, how it all comes together now, talking to you as well. You're saying death is part of life and we should start accepting that. And maybe what you're saying about the death cafes and death at dinner, that we can discuss this, make it part of life. And I was wondering, as death is a transition journey, whether it's a short journey or a longer journey, I'm wondering if, maybe you came across how people react to transitions in their lives. does that mirror how they do the transition of dying? You know, if someone is hesitant with the transition period in their lives, or they struggle with change, if that would maybe have an effect on how they do the transition when they're passing on.
That's a very interesting question now. Not one I really focused on, but I guess it must have some impact. Maybe the best way to answer it is that I interviewed a death doula. I don't know if you are familiar with death doulas, but as with the birth doula who helps you with the birthing process, the death doula is generally a non-medical person who helps you with your spiritual journey and helps you along your process to the end. And she said to me, when I asked her, is there a difference between dying young and dying old? And she said, it depends on the person's personal journey. And she said, some old people are ready to go and they've had enough. Maybe at 60 they feel they've done what they came to do, and they've had enough and it's time for them. And then you might have someone who at 98 is railing against the faith and saying, no, I'm not ready to go yet. And similarly with the younger person, she said, obviously with the younger person, we are conditioned to feel it's sad and it's worse because they died young before they filled their potential. Whereas with an older person, it's more accepting. But she did say to me that it is really very much around the personal approach to life, how you die. So I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but I would imagine it must have an impact, how accepting you are, how open you are. But I also think, I think life changes you. I think what happens to you personally along your journey must have an impact on how you approach your own death, I would imagine.
I agree, and also the way you approach many things in your life, and life is a growing process.
It is.
So I believe that the way we think about death and dying is also a growing process. And I love that we have this talk to make it more a part of life.
Absolutely. And what you want, I think, also changes. I think one of the things that surprised me, I thought everyone would want to die at home because that's what I want. I don't want to be in a hospital. I am ICU trained, but I don't want to be in that situation. And so one of the biggest surprises to me in subsequent literature that I read was how many people don't want to die at home for various reasons. Some of them don't want to burden their families. Some of them are scared of dying in pain or not being able to breathe and all of those things, and they feel that being in a hospital situation is better for them, and they're calmer about that. So that was immensely interesting to me. And as you go through your ages, a lot of people said to me, one of the ladies, Cheryl, in the thesis, said to me when she started thinking about death and dying, her father died when she was very young, and her mother died when she was 90, her mom was 90. And she said how she feels about what she wants for her death is very different now, having gone through both experiences, than what she probably would have wanted if she'd only experienced her father's death. So I thought that was very interesting. So I think things will change as you get older and you have more life experiences.
Linda, I'm thinking about something you said earlier about having a good death. Is this related to what you are saying now, that each person's preference of dying constitutes what they consider a good death?
Absolutely. And there is an official definition of a good death, and that's basically what it says, to give the patient a death that is consistent with what they include their families and their caregivers, what they would all want, in keeping with what's possible, and in keeping with the cultural, social norms. So, yes, I believe it is a very individual process, and that was a hard lesson for me, Thea, because I really did come into this work with a very defined understanding of what I thought. And I have ended up going, well, actually, it's really up to you. But I think the important thing is that you have to think about it.
I'm just thinking, Linda, with COVID now, many people have been their right or the ability to choose that good death has actually been taken away from them and their families.
Yeah.
Especially in the beginning. Now we know a little bit more, but especially in the beginning, where people were diagnosed with COVID, they went to hospital, families expecting their loved ones to return, and they never did. Some people never, ever, ever saw their loved ones again. When they saw them, it was ashes, or this person, their loved one, was wrapped in plastic. They could never, ever see that person again. So how does, what impact does that have on the family that's left behind? Because I hear you say good death is about the person's preference or how they would like to die. It may be connected to their beliefs, their spirituality, their tradition, etc. How does this pandemic affect good death and families not being able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think of how things are happening now, I actually cannot even imagine what that's like for everybody involved. You know, I think I think the caregivers are in just as much a state of stress as the patients. And you're right, in the beginning, you know, it was quick. You're in, and then 24 hours later, you get the phone call, sorry. A friend of mine's mom is currently in ICU, and she's had one video call with her in the week. She's not allowed in. And I'm sitting there thinking, when my dad died, I was there with him as much as I could be, and I'm still traumatized. It was still traumatic. So to not be there, not say goodbye, I think must be incredibly difficult. I actually can't answer. You are better placed, I think, maybe to answer the grieving process of it. But I have been doing a lot of reading, and a couple of interesting things have arisen. So the first one, which was quite shocking to me, was in a study in The Lancet. I think it was. Don't quote me on that. I'll confirm it. But basically, they were saying, you know, even now when it's clear that there is no hope, that it's really this person is dying and they're struggling, and the best we can do is make them comfortable. The families are still pushing for ventilation, for the full hypermedicalization, even though there's no hope. And how hard that is for the caregivers, the hospital staff, to explain to them, you saw your dad yesterday, but actually today, this is the end of the line. And so that was quite a surprise, because I thought that would kind of not arise, but it's still there. The very things I was arguing in the paper are still there. Secondly, the more interesting data that's coming out is about the transition from hospital care to home death, that there's a higher number of home-based deaths, and it is around exactly what you're saying, because now we know that, in the beginning it was like, go to hospital, get as much treatment as you could. Now people know this thing, people are reluctant to go to hospital, and so more and more COVID cases are dying at home. And so I think that's been a really big shift. And the other interesting shift, which is not related to death but to elder care, is also around how, for the longest time, we have put our elderly in retirement villages, in frail care and various kinds of facilities. But with COVID, there's been a shift to bringing the elderly home, because people didn't want to leave them there where they couldn't have access to them. So that's been it's just an aside to the death question. But I think as far as grief is concerned, there are lots of studies, which you will know, where they were saying, when patients have died in hospital or have died hypermedicalized deaths, which these are by and large, that the caregiver stats are something like 78% of those people of their families suffer from either acute or chronic depression. They haven't been able to manage, the death as they would have liked. So I think those are very real concerns. And I think if you look back through the history of death and dying, if you look back to how the bubonic plague changed us, how the Spanish flu, we're in for a big change.
Yeah.
In how we die.
So, Linda, very, very interesting. Eden FM listeners, we are just forgetting about time tonight. We are talking to Linda Ravenhill about death and dying. Please don't switch your dial. Please stay on the radio and come back. We're going to listen to another music. This is Linda's playlist, of course. We're listening to Another Universe from Springbok Nude Girls. Enjoy it.
Let's take the final.
Eden FM listeners, we are back with Linda Ravenhill and we are talking about death and dying. And we've had such an interesting conversation up until now. Linda, before the break, we were talking about family members not being able to say goodbye to people that have died of COVID. And we were talking about having a good death, what it means, how does it affect the family. I was just thinking in terms of, with the COVID, with the waves that we've had, some of the hospital regulations said no visitations, and I mean, I get it. But how do you say goodbye to somebody waving from a window or on a screen when you know that your loved one is dying? That's the one part of the question. This other part is the impact that it has on the nursing staff. Because who takes up that strain? And how does it affect people?
Yeah. I think that goes to the heart of the pandemic, really. And to be honest, I really don't know how you do that. As far as the visiting hours and the way that all of that is managed, there are studies coming out now. I was reading today where they're considering rethinking how we manage COVID deaths. So, we're still new as a pandemic goes. It's only been a year. I don't know if you guys can believe that it's the 4th of March was a year since patient zero. I mean, where have we been for the last year? But I think as far as that goes, that if you look at the Spanish flu, it was 5 years. We're still learning. And one of the papers that I read said that the point of greatest threat of infection is in changing in and out of your PPE, of your protective gear. And so they were saying, is it really that necessary for the families to be excluded from their patients' final hours or their loved ones' final hours, if that is the case? So I think that as time goes and we start to understand more about COVID, those regulations will change, which doesn't help the people who've gone through it in the beginning. And I think it's everybody. I think it's the whole chain of care. It's from the family members, the person themselves, the family members, the nurses, as you say. But there's people like the funeral directors and the people that are burying these dead. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, normally you have access, you can talk about things. These people must be just beside themselves. So as a nursing sister, I cannot even begin to imagine. I'm not very good with death. I cried with every single one of my patients' deaths. I'm absolutely useless. And you know what? I'm not sorry, because I think that's what makes you human. It takes its toll. And yes, I wasn't working in ICU in the pandemic, but under many difficult circumstances. And I think, as I was saying before the break, I think when we look back in maybe 2-3 years, things will be very different. I think people's attitudes towards death and dying within the hospital setting and within society will be very different, because how could they not be? So I'm hopeful that in time, the restrictions will change a little bit. Maybe people will be able to see their loved ones. And as you were saying before the break, it's not only COVID patients, everybody's in this. If you're in there for a heart transplant or, a bypass, the same rules apply to you. And that's tough, But I think everybody's just trying to do the best they can at this stage with the knowledge at hand.
Yeah, I would just want to applaud the nursing staff, because I think they are always the ones that have to, they know. I've asked, how do you know that this person is dying? They know. I think it's years and years of experience. And when I think about my colleagues, I can just I remember how they just go into this different state of care for this patient. They become so, not that they're not tender other times, but they become so tender and caring about this patient. And it's beautiful. So I just want to applaud all the nursing staff out there for having to face this, because it's not easy to face somebody who's dying.
No, I do.
So now you wanted to ask something?
I'm wondering, Linda, as a sister, ICU sister, and also with your research that you've done, the body's process of dying, how the body's locking down slowly and surely. I'm just wondering if we don't need maybe more information on that as a community, as people, as, you know, to understand, because I often think that even doctors don't really acknowledge the way that the body is shutting down.
Yeah.
And, you know, trying to feed a body that's actually trying to shut down, isn't that very disrespectful, in my opinion? You know, how do we acknowledge the body's process of dying, not only the emotional process?
Sure, and it's actually what was quite shocking to me, Ronelle, to say when I was talking to the doctors, is how little training they actually have about death and dying and the process, and the reason is always stated, and it's the same as with nurses. We're in the business of saving people. Everything in your training is towards saving people. So having to dedicate time to what it looks like when you can't save them is not a popular process. I think that is changing, but right now that's where we stand. And so as far as understanding the process of death and dying, I think that goes to public education, and I think there are people trying to do it, but there's so much resistance as a society to it. People still don't want to talk about it. I think that's changing now, but I think it would take the fear out of the process. This is natural. What's happening here is natural. This is going to happen. And there is a step. If you look at the hospice guidelines, and if you look at any of the literature, they actually explain it so beautifully. And when you read it, it's not as intimidating or that's just something you can't face, because they've told it in such a way that there's a story here, and this is what's going to happen, and don't worry, it's okay if that happens, he's not in pain. I think that would go a long way to helping us as a society, or as people, as humans, just understand this as part of the process. But it starts with stopping, ironically, the avoidance of talking about death and dying.
Sorry.
No, there is a neuropsychologist, psychiatrist, I forget his name. Maybe when I come back I'll have his name. But he actually explains the process about, he was a neurologist who didn't believe in the process of life after death, but he didn't believe that there was nothing to be afraid of, because he came from a very clinical background. And then he started interviewing patients who were dying. And it changed his whole attitude towards it. And really, he listened to him talk, and just reading his papers is incredibly comforting. After I read his talks, I was like, okay, I can do this. It's not so bad. But it's about being open to it, and for the medical profession as a whole, to not avoid talking about death, and to really face it head on. And I think if we do it, then the rest of society will face it. But it's about taking that stigma, because there is a stigma around dying, away from things. I think will clear our path.
And maybe that is part of the gift of the pandemic, is that we are faced. We are so much more. Every day we think about death, you know, and how many times we've discussed this topic.
Absolutely. And that's what I was saying. If you look at the history, if you trace the history of dying through the ages, every time there's been something like a pandemic, Spanish flu, the bubonic plague, it has changed the trajectory of how we think about dying. And I believe we're in that moment now, for the next shift.
I just want to reflect on and it ties back to what we're saying now in your dissertation you write. it's a quote from Steve Jobs that says, "No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there." And it's about this fear that we have of the unknown, and even the fear of death. And even, I think, if you have that belief of this is what my belief system says, this is where I'm going, it's still filled with anxiety.
Yeah. I mean, as I said to you, I'm scared. I mean, I've done all this research and I live this, breathe this, it's my absolute passion. And I often sit at night and I go, I have all this knowledge, has it made me calmer? And I'm thinking, well, I'm more informed, but I'm still scared, I think it's Steve Jobs, who says there, don't let anyone tell you. And in the end of my thesis, I gave you a quote from one of my financial advisors when I asked everybody I interviewed, what is your version of a good death? That was the question I ended with. And he said, well, I don't know. I really don't know what I think. He said, but I believe in David Bloch's theory that we're all just space dust. At the end of the day, there's nothing left. It's not such a big drama. It's not so traumatic. We just disappear into the ether. But then he ended it with a caveat, which I love, saying, but what if we're wrong? And I think that, which I absolutely love, because it summed up everything. Yes, we're great, we're fine. But what if we're wrong? There's always going to be that, because you don't know. How would we ever know? So how will we ever know? Yeah. But at least start the conversation. Talk. I mean, if we just talk like this, already, it gives you food to think about, and it's already taking away some of that anxiety and fear.
Sure. We have run out of time. We've run out of time. It's gone so quickly, Linda. It was very interesting. Before we greet you, I'm just going to ask Ronelle and Hans maybe to say something quickly to Linda. Ronelle?
Linda, thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this research and opening up this topic. And please come back that we can talk to you again.
Thank you, Ronelle. Thank you for the platform. I'll be, as Hans will know, I talk a lot. So thanks for having me. And really thank you for just putting this out there, and hopefully it sparks a conversation.
Hans?
Well, certainly the last word on death hasn't been said, but it was really interesting listening to you. Yeah, thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Hans.
Yeah, there's a saying that goes, it ain't over till the fat lady sings.
Absolutely.
The show is over. Linda, it's been very informative. I hope that we can get you back again. And I just want to leave with death is a process, and death is a celebration, and death is part of life as well. Listeners, please come back. Today was our 50th episode. Congratulate us on Facebook, please. We're going to listen to Edith Piaf from La Vie and Rose sings it. So take care. See you next week. Wanneer ons weer koppe bymekaar sit. Good night.
Thank you so much, guys.